So here we have practice problem number 2 for chapter 2. And I'm not going to go over the journal entries because you should be familiar with those by now after working the first practice problem in class. Our goal with this schedule of cost of goods manufactured is to provide quite a bit of detail about this very important number at the bottom, the cost of goods that we finished manufacturing during the period. These are our new finished goods, the ones we finished making during the period. You'll see over here in the work in process T account, this was the cost of the goods that came out of work in process and went into finished goods because we finished making them. And we want to explain, well, where did the cost come from? So what amount of this total represents direct material cost, direct labor cost, and manufacturing overhead? Because as you know, those are our 3 subcategories of manufacturing costs. And you'll notice that we're going to use that basic accounting equation twice in this particular schedule. The one where we take a beginning amount, add the new costs, subtract an ending balance to get our answer, and we use that basic formula to calculate cost of goods sold, but we're also going to use it twice here with one modification. So up above in the first section, we're going to address the cost of the direct materials first, those that were put into production during the period. And we'll use the basic formula I mentioned a second ago to explain the changes in the raw materials inventory account. So we started out with a beginning balance of raw materials that were in our storeroom. We purchased 164,000 more during the period. So total materials available to us were 174,800. And we're going to explain, where did these total materials go? Well, 29,800 of them we still have left in the materials storeroom. So this difference here must be the dollar amount of raw materials that were put into production. And we see this 145,000 over here on the credit side of the raw materials account coming out of raw materials and going into production. However, this 145,000 includes some indirect materials too, because we put both indirect and direct materials into the raw materials inventory account. Now, indirect materials, as you know, they're part of manufacturing overhead. And the indirect materials that we put into production during this period, there were 18,000. And we debited those indirect materials to manufacturing overhead. And we see that down here in this account for transaction B. So since we're including indirect materials in the manufacturing overhead costs, we don't want to double count them and include them as part of our direct material cost up in this section. So we're going to subtract them out, and this amount, this remaining balance of 127,000, that represents just the direct materials that were put into production. And this amount corresponds with the 127,000 we debited to work in process for the direct materials put into production. So now we'll move on to the second subcategory, direct labor, and the 94,000 represents the direct labor cost for the production that took place during this period. Finally, we come to the manufacturing overhead, and here we're going to put not the actual manufacturing overhead cost incurred, but rather the amount we applied to production using the POHR. And so remember, looking at our manufacturing overhead account over here on the left, we've been accumulating all the actual overhead charges on the debit side of the account. But the amount that we added to the job cost sheets, that we added to work in process, that amount was $88,800. And that's the amount that we're considering to have been put into production. So the total of these three numbers, that equals our total manufacturing cost for the period. And I think of this as the total new manufacturing cost that was incurred during the period. But we also had a beginning balance in work in process. And so these were the goods still in process at the end of last year that now have become the costs in our beginning work in process account. So we're going to take those new manufacturing costs incurred this period, add them to the beginning work in process costs to get this subtotal, and then subtract the cost of the goods still in process at the end of the period to get our cost of goods manufactured. Notice here we're using that basic equation a second time, but rather than taking a beginning balance and adding new costs, we flip the order. We're taking these new costs and adding them to the beginning balance. But again, we're subtracting the ending balance to get to our answer. So this amount represents the cost of the goods that we finished manufacturing during the period, including our direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead.